If you and I are having a conversation face to face, our sense of left and right will be incompatible, but our sense of north and south will be exactly the same. Which way is left and which way is right is, in this sense, subjective. Subjective doesn't mean unreal. Subjective doesn't mean open to endless debate. Subjective doesn't even mean there are 2 or 3 or 5 different opinions about it that are equally valid. The number one answer I receive today defending adults playing video games is that the value or the enjoyment of playing video games is subjective, right? Now, there are 2 different ways in which, in this video, I'm going to argue that this is bad and misleading and wrong. These aren't the only 2 ways in which this is bad and misleading and wrong, by the way, guys. One is on the tiny scale of you and I as individuals, and the other is on the larger scale of a society. And the society might just be a few dozen people, or we might be talking about millions of people. All right? Will it make you happy personally if you can inject yourself with testosterone, become stronger, and win an athletic competition? Let's say it's wrestling. If you personally can use testosterone and steroids and be stronger and maybe more beautiful or more physically impressive, and then you can win the wrestling competition, nobody else is using testosterone and steroids, just you. Is that good for you? Is that good for your personal utility, for your well-being, for your happiness, your benefit? It's not the only consideration. We have to scale it up and ask, what's better for this tiny society of maybe just a few dozen people who actually compete in this sports league, who compete in this wrestling league, whatever it may be, all right? Is it good for them? Is it good for us as a group if instead of competing on skill, people start competing on the basis of who can take the most steroids? No, even if it's good for you as an individual, when you just scale it up to consider the few dozen people you're competing with, and they're not your enemies, they're your colleagues, they're your contemporaries, right? It's bad for everyone, including you. Why? Because when all of your competition start doing it, when everyone else is injecting themselves with testosterone and steroids, now you've got to inject yourself with more and more and more in order to compete. You've got to push yourself up to that limit where maybe you're going to die just to stay relevant, just to stay in the same league that they're in. All right? Beauty pageants, beauty competitions. Should you allow plastic surgery? What's the competition supposed to be about? Is it supposed to be about who can get the most plastic surgery? If you allow the contestants to have plastic surgery, we have a similar pattern. We have a similar problem. But this isn't the only level on which we can scale up this problem. When you're looking at a society of millions, who are you celebrating as the world wrestling champion? The greatest cheater, the greatest drug abuser. That's a problem for us all, not just the people in the competition. Who are you celebrating as the beauty pageant queen? The greatest science experiment. The woman who was willing to subject herself to the surgeon's knife and injecting all kinds of drugs that are in their way, comparable to steroids and what have you, right? If you open that door, if you allow that. These concepts of like good, happiness, enjoyment, utility, right? They don't just apply in this self-centered, short-term way. Self-centered, short-term thinking is evil. You just thinking about what benefits you, what makes you happy right now, whether it's using drugs or getting plastic surgery or playing video games, that is, in brief, an evil way of thinking. You know what's good? You know what's better? Not just thinking about yourself, thinking about your family, thinking about that medium-sized unit, the other people who play in your league, thinking about the society of millions. Not just thinking short-term, not just thinking about what's going to make me happy today or in the next 2 hours, but thinking about what kind of person I aspire to become over the next 10 years, and then what kind of work and what kind of recreation is going to help me become that person, right? It doesn't take a genius to figure this stuff out. It really doesn't. I don't even think it requires a person of average intelligence. But in our generation, people have been inculcated with this notion that morality is something imposed upon you by authority figures like the church, the mosque, and that you live to rebel against. And so people don't rehearse, don't practice. They become profoundly unfamiliar with this type of ever so simple ethical thinking, reasoning out for themselves why and in what sense playing video games is wrong. The distinction between subjective and objective. I've had to say to people who debated with me sincerely, they were really willing to reevaluate what they've been doing with their lives in the past, in the present, and looking to the future. So people who came to me and talked to me on the internet, they're willing to consider the option of quitting video games now and forever. But it seems like the thing they can't get over is this idea that even if all of my arguments are valid, even if I have a good point, they can recognize it. They can recognize that this would make them into a better person if they stopped playing video games and started doing anything more productive with their time. They can't get over this thought-terminating cliche that after all, it's all just subjective, right? The difference between left and right is subjective. The difference between good and evil is subjective. And I'll tell you something directly from experience. I have used cocaine once in my life. Whether or not you consider the effects of cocaine pleasant or unpleasant, even that is subjective. I can't believe that anyone is stupid enough to think that using cocaine makes them happy. I can't believe just the chemical sensation in your body and your brain. I can't believe people think that is pleasant or enjoyable or is in any way related to happiness. But apparently I'm in a tiny, tiny minority of people, right? And when I watch someone playing a stupid, repetitive video game where they walk around and shoot people in the head again and again and again, I find myself in a similar state of disbelief. Subjectively, I can't believe people think this is enjoyable, people think this is happiness, but they do. I'm evidently in a very small minority who has this kind of detachment where I can reevaluate these things subjectively. Okay? The question of what is a great work of art is subjective. That doesn't mean there's no important difference between a great work of art and a terrible one, between a successful film and an unsuccessful one, between a painting that's a recognized masterpiece and a painting that was a flop. Fill in the blank. Yes, these things are subjective. But what you have to recognize is that the whole world of important decisions you are going to make in your life is within that subjective realm. We're not debating the speed of light. We're not debating the speed of sound. We're debating what kind of person you want to be and what you're willing to sacrifice, what you're willing to do to get there. It's all subjective. The whole question of a meaningful life, the whole question of whether you are a hero or a villain in your own imagination and in how others perceive you. Yes, it's subjective. And there's always going to be a disconnection between the subjective and the objective that way. We can write out a chemical formula for what cocaine is, and we can chart out the etiology step by step of its effects on the brain, its effects on the nervous system, and so on. But the subjective judgment, whether this is pleasure or pain, enjoyable or horrible, whether this is good and evil, that's the meaningful question. It's utterly subjective. Whether it's good for me right now, thinking selfishly, thinking short term about just the next few hours, subjective, tremendously meaningful. Whether or not it's good for my family. What's it going to mean for my daughter if I start using cocaine? Just on the weekends. Oh, it's not an addiction. It's not a habit. It's just once in a while. It's just on special occasions. What's that going to mean for my daughter, for my wife, for whoever it is I have around me? Right? What's it going to mean for my team, my league, the few dozen people who are my colleagues and contemporary? Scale it up. What's it going to mean for your society as a whole? Think it through at every level. And don't just think short term. The distinction between subjective and objective. This is child's play. Don't let this kind of excuse become, for you, a thought-terminating cliche.